It's always funny when the progressive zeitgeist tries to critique itself. It's funny when they finally get around to acknowledging the obvious pitfalls of their grand social experiment, and then they try to address those pitfalls by the same faulty logic. On that note, I came across this opinion piece from the New York Times called "The Disappearance of Literary Men Should Worry Everyone." This is something that I've thought about myself quite a bit. You know, the days of Herman Melville, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, those seem to be in the rearview mirror. But let's see if the New York Times has any insight into why that is. Over the past 2 decades, literary fiction has become a largely female pursuit. Novels are increasingly written by women and read by women. In 2004, about half of the authors on the New York Times fiction bestseller list were women and about half men. This year, the list looks to be more than 3/4 women. See, already it's interesting here how an opinion piece in the New York Times is sort of critiquing the New York Times bestseller list. Like, you're the one in charge of deciding all this gibberish, aren't you? Anyway, continuing here. According to multiple reports, women readers now account for about 80% of fiction sales. That's interesting. 80% is a lot, but I'd be curious to know how big the actual pie itself is. I'd be curious to know how much reading or fiction sales have shrunk in general from what they used to be. I imagine it's shrunk quite a bit, so 80% of, an ever-dwindling number is probably not that good. Okay, then the author of the article here has some anecdote about creative writing classes. It's not really relevant. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to skip over this part. But the article continues. Male underrepresentation is an uncomfortable topic in a literary world otherwise highly attuned to such imbalances. We've got the sort of HR speak. We were just being mindful of our imbalances, that's all it was. In 2022, the novelist Joyce Carol Oates wrote on Twitter that a friend who is a literary agent told me that he cannot even get editors to read first novels by young male writers, no matter how good. The public response to Ms. Oates' comments was swift and cutting, not entirely without reason, as the book world does remain overwhelmingly white. But the lack of concern about the fate of male writers was striking. Yeah, I remember that. I remember when Joyce Carol Oates, who is very much a progressive in good standing herself, I remember when she made the mistake of trying to tell the truth and got dogpiled and ripped apart. You'll notice that the writer of this opinion piece does very little to sort of investigate the very crabs in a bucket nature of the sort of modern literary sphere. The author is also sort of running defense for this literary echo chamber. He says, well, it wasn't entirely without reason. The author is already splitting hairs here. Well, the book industry is overwhelmingly white. This is always working from the premise that this is some sort of top-down conspiracy. The author of this article here never bothers to interrogate the premise of, maybe organizing what should be a sort of merit-based artistic industry. Like, maybe it's a bad idea to try and artificially push it one way or another based on one's demographic traits. If you ever look at literary journals, or if you look at literary agents who are accepting submissions, a good chunk of them, the super majority, they will say something like, especially looking for manuscripts by underrepresented communities, especially looking for manuscripts from women and BIPOC authors and et cetera, more than just putting up a sign that not so subtly says, white guys apply elsewhere. There's also sort of the element of self-selection where if you are a writer who does not fit the desired demographic traits, you're going to look at something like that and you're going to say, I don't want to deal with this. If you've got half a brain, you're probably going to say, I don't think this is for me, really. The author continues here, and here's where it gets real interesting. To be clear, I welcome the end of male dominance in literature. Men ruled the roost for far too long, too often at the expense of great women writers who ought to have been read instead. Now, that's a very big claim to make for, what is the proof of a statement like that? That there was all these women in the shadows who were just too oppressed to penetrate the zeitgeist. And the other thing is, what is the criteria you're judging this from? Women authors who ought to have been read instead of who? Instead of, again, Hemingway, instead of Steinbeck, instead of Herman Melville? Was there a secret woman hidden in the shadows who had written something of the caliber of Moby Dick, who just didn't get her fair shot because she was chained to the kitchen stove. The article continues here. I also don't think that men deserve to be better represented in literary fiction. They don't suffer from the same kind of prejudice that women have long endured. Okay, but in the beginning of the article here, it says that in 2004, half the authors on the New York Times list were women. That, that's pretty good, right? So in 2004, at least, we had a pretty solid gender parity, but then I don't understand. There's still discrimination happening. Continuing here. Furthermore, young men should be reading Sally Rooney and Elena Ferrante. Male readers don't need to be paired with male writers. Sure, that's true, but why not Virginia Woolf or Dorothy Parker? Why does it have to be Sally Rooney? Why does it have to be these women who are very much a part of the sort of modern progressive literary zeitgeist? Why not Virginia Woolf? Why not Dorothy Parker? Why not J.K. Rowling? Why not J.K. Rowling? She's one of the biggest authors of the past 20 to 50 years. I imagine J.K. Rowling got a lot of young men reading books at the height of the Harry Potter craze. Is the author just going to ignore that so many of the authors who do appeal to men? Is the author just going to ignore that so many of these authors have been sort of dragged through the mud for the last decade? The sort of classical literary canon has been deemed too white, too male, too colonialist. The author of this article is pointing out the problem, but refuses to address why that problem might have arose in the first place. He says here that male readers don't need to be paired with male writers, but that should go both ways, right? Except it doesn't really, not in a progressive zeitgeist. The last 10 years have been all about representation. You can't truly connect with a piece of art if it's not made by someone who represents your particular demographic. So why would that work for everybody else, but not for prospective male readers? Then the author complains about Donald Trump. He mentions Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan. And as you read this, you begin to understand that the reason why more men aren't reading, why there aren't more male authors, is kind of self-evident, is because this shit is totally unappealing to a lot of men. You've got the same people, the same institutions who sort of poured the gasoline, who lit the match. These same people are then pointing out, isn't it bad how everybody's on fire? If only we could do something about all these fires. I don't know how they happened. Trump, skipping ahead in the article a bit. These young men need better stories, and they need to see themselves as belonging to the world of storytelling. Novels do many things. They entertain, inspire, puzzle, hypnotize. But reading fiction is also an excellent way to improve one's emotional IQ. See, there always has to be some sort of utility. It's about your emotional IQ. If we want to cure these wayward young men of their listening to Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan, well, we just have to improve their emotional IQs. And the way to do that is for them to read Normal People by Sally Rooney. I think that will really help get these little freaks under control. Continuing here, novels help us form our identities and understand our lives. Like many other bookish Gen Xers, I can't conceive of my formative whatever. Nobody cares about your formative years, blah, blah, blah. This is why we need a more inclusive literary culture, one that will bring young men in from the cold. Do you think this way of speaking is appealing to young men who might read books? Do you think appealing to an inclusive literary culture, do you think that is going to encourage more of the guys who sort of turned away from books and reading? Do you think that's going to bring them back in? The author of the article closes with a quote from feminist scholar Bell Hooks, and while it's in general, it's well-meaning, it is still rife with the language of the progressive zeitgeist. We're going to transgress patriarchal boundaries. And again, the author and the article, it makes it self-evident why men have sort of turned away from books and literature. It's because the whole thing has become a sort of therapy speak sewing circle. And it's not like the divide or the discrepancy is between like a more sensitive, more thoughtful, more feminine point of view and a more sort of masculine, rugged, keeping your feelings close to your chest. That's not the divide that's really going on here. It's the fact that all this shit is fake and inauthentic, and it uses sort of the language of sensitivity to just sort of lie and gaslight and pull the wool over people's eyes, whereas sort of the male literary figures of yesteryear, their most persuasive element was their authenticity, or a sense of authenticity. You know, the article points towards video games and social media, which absolutely is a huge factor in why people are reading less, but then it's probably a bad idea to compound all that by being consistently hostile to men in general. You know, that's the real sort of core of the entire thing, is that the entire sort of media sphere has been outwardly hostile to men, and it's kind of slimy to me to pretend that isn't the case, or to try and distract from that with all this other hand-waving and gaslighting. I don't know. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Let me know what you think. Subscribe. I write books. That was sort of the whole, what caught my attention is, you know, hey, I'm a guy. I write books. I don't know why. It is true that if you're a guy trying to sort of break into any sort of literary, it's an uphill battle. But anyway, check out my books if you want. I'll put the link to those down below. There's also some short stories and etc. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Goodbye.